What happened inside this desert motel room will shock you. The story began with a short archived dispatch entry that mentioned an abandoned room in a sunburned motel. The entry raised questions about a lone traveler whose final hours left investigators uneasy even years later. Kieran Voss was 34 and worked as a freelance surveyor who traveled often for land assessment work in the Southwest. He checked into a fading desert motel during late summer in 2009 after finishing a long day along dry county borders. He planned to rest for one night, then drive toward a small town office that expected his final report. He carried a basic camera case for field notes, which rarely held anything interesting. The room looked ordinary when he opened the door and noticed a soft hum from an older cooling unit mounted near the window. He dropped his duffel on the creaking bed frame and stretched while dust drifted gently across a low beam of late sunlight. He wanted a quick shower, followed by simple dinner before reviewing a few notes for the next morning. He felt tired yet comfortable because the area had always seemed quiet during previous drives through the region. The incident began when he stepped out of the shower and heard a muffled thud against the far side wall. He thought another guest had slammed something heavy, though the motel parking area looked nearly empty earlier that afternoon. He wrapped a towel around his shoulders and paused while drops of water fell onto cracked tile lines. He called out through the thin wall and asked if everything was all right since the noise sounded forceful and strange. No voice answered and another sharp thud followed, which made him walk toward the sound with growing concern. He pressed his hand against fading wallpaper and felt a faint vibration that lasted only a few seconds before stopping. He considered contacting the front desk, but wanted to check the connecting walkway first because the layout formed a simple line of rooms. He put on his clothes, grabbed his camera case, and stepped outside. The walkway looked empty, except for drifting tumbleweed fibers that rolled along a fading concrete edge near the vending machine. He knocked on the neighboring door while evening heat pushed against his back and waited without hearing movement inside the room. He tried the knob, which rattled lightly as if something rested against the interior floor. He decided to alert the owner who lived in a small structure behind the office. The motel owner was an older man named Orrin Gale, who kept careful handwritten logs for each room, including maintenance notes. He walked with Kieran toward the quiet guest door while holding a ring of dull brass keys that clinked softly in the warm breeze. He mentioned that the room had not been rented in nearly a week due to a faulty vent that needed parts. He seemed confused that anyone could be inside since he checked the space that morning. They opened the door carefully and smelled a strong metallic scent that made both men step back with startled confusion. Light from the walkway spilled across a messy floor where scattered water stains surrounded a tipped metal chair under the broken vent. The room appeared recently disturbed, although no signs pointed toward forced entry or violent struggle. Kieran noticed a faint trail of darker stains that ran toward the bathroom, which deepened the sense of unease. Orrin called local deputies while Kieran studied the disorder with a mix of fear and professional habit because surveyors sometimes documented minor structural issues. He raised his camera and snapped several quick photos that showed the scattered debris with surprising clarity in the dim light. He found a small, torn corner of motel stationery under the chair that carried a short message written in rushed handwriting. The message read, "I heard it again, and I think it moved above me," which startled him. Deputies arrived after dusk and began a careful search while asking both men to wait outside and recount every detail they remembered. One deputy returned holding a crumpled plastic cup from the bathroom sink that contained thin grains of sand. Another deputy noted that the vent showed recent scraping marks inside, which looked fresh and unsettling. The older ductwork stretched across the motel roof, where desert winds often carried loose grit. Investigation records later showed that Kieran gave a steady statement describing the two thuds and the strange scent upon entry. Deputies asked him to provide the photos he took, which they added to the case report for detailed review. The images showed the torn note near the chair, which matched the handwriting of a previous guest who stayed in that room during late spring. That guest had left abruptly, according to the clerk, who remembered the man looking exhausted and tense. The complication grew when deputies located a second note tucked behind the vent where only careful searching revealed its shape. It read, Something crawls in the duct at night, and I hear it pause near my room every hour, which alarmed the team. The wording suggested the writer stayed awake through long nights, hoping the noise would stop, yet nothing in the ducts seemed alive after inspection. Dust and sand filled most gaps, yet scraping marks looked unsettlingly recent, according to the maintenance tech who assisted that night. Kieran watched search teams climb onto the roof where the wide ducts stretched across peeling tar paper warmed by lingering heat. They opened a large access panel and found another patch of dried sand arranged in an unusual pattern that suggested repeated shifting from interior airflow. No footprints appeared near the access hatch, even though the sand inside looked disturbed. The contrast puzzled every person involved because the roof surface showed nothing except natural wind marks. Reportedly, a nearby gas station clerk later told deputies that a travel-worn stranger visited often during early summer, asking about strange humming near the motel. Witness statements described the stranger as anxious, with a habit of looking at the motel roof whenever vehicles passed. Deputies tried to locate him again, but records showed no trace after midsummer. The detail matched the uneasy tone in the notes found inside the room. The twist began forming once the maintenance tech reviewed old duct diagrams stored in a dusty motel drawer. The diagram showed a sealed crawl space above the guest rooms that had been abandoned following a storm during 2003. The space once connected to an older storage platform that sagged heavily under damaged planks. If anything heavy shifted on that aging support, it could create sudden thuds that echoed through the walls. Deputies climbed back up to inspect the crawl space using stronger lights, while the motel owner waited silently near the walkway. They discovered that one plank had snapped recently, leaving a gouge in the wooden edge that matched the scrape marks inside the vent. Sand had blown into the access gap for years, causing shifting layers that moved in heavy wind or abrupt temperature drops. That motion explained the strange patterns above the ceiling and the uneasy humming guests reported. The investigators concluded that each thud Kieran heard happened when the remaining weakened planks flexed under trapped sand, which dropped onto the ductwork. The metallic scent came from older insulation mats leaking residue as the panels bent sharply following long exposure to dry heat. The notes from earlier guests captured fear without understanding the structural issue hidden above the rooms. Each writer felt watched from above, but no person ever entered the space after the storm years earlier. Kieran listened quietly as deputies explained the findings, which eased his concern while leaving him shaken from the tense experience. He returned to his room and packed carefully, feeling grateful that nothing more sinister waited inside the aging walls. He slept in his truck that night because quiet desert wind felt safer than the room after everything he witnessed. Dawn arrived with calm, golden light that softened the harsh memory of the strange evening. Years later, the motel replaced the roof and fully sealed the old crawl space due to safety recommendations from county inspectors. Travelers rarely knew anything about the incident, though a few locals still remembered the night deputies searched the narrow ducts. Kieran kept one printed copy of his photos, which he stored with other unusual field records that marked strange workdays. He considered the event a reminder that fear can grow quickly when simple structural problems mimic hidden threats. When people pass that deserted stretch today, they see nothing more than weathered walls standing against dry wind under wide sky. The mystery sits quietly in dusty archives, where the notes from worried guests still rest beside the final maintenance report. The truth brought no dramatic revelation, yet the incident carried enough tension to unsettle anyone who hears the details. It leaves a lasting reminder that even ordinary places can scare deeply when small, unseen failures create shadows that feel alive. Never follow back roads near that main lake. The woods around Lake Mattawamkeag are vast and unforgiving even in the heart of the brief northern summer season. This particular story begins on a warm, clear afternoon in late July of 1987, deep within the sparsely populated Maine wilderness. The main character was a highly meticulous man named Arthur Gagne, a 40-year-old cartographer from outside Boston who deeply loved solitude. Arthur had recently secured a small research grant to locate and precisely verify several extremely old boundary survey markers in this unorganized, remote territory. His simple professional goal for that warm day was locating a century-old granite survey marker known as Benchmark A, located near a remote, difficult stretch of the lakeshore. He parked his battered 1979 Ford pickup truck near the very edge of the narrow paved road where the thick and intimidating woods began their oppressive domination. Arthur then began his strenuous and difficult hike carrying a heavy backpack, his brass theodolite, and a bulky old wooden tripod for the necessary equipment. He intended to be back at his truck by sunset, completing the critical survey data collection before the daylight faded and the twilight wildlife became fully active. The incident started almost immediately when he found an unmarked, narrow logging track that was certainly not included on any state or county map he possessed. It looked very newly cut, a raw, dark scar running straight toward the benchmark's projected location near the private, undeveloped stretch of the lakeshore. This unexpected and unrecorded shortcut felt like extraordinary luck, a valuable and necessary gift from the tangled and often completely impassable Maine woods landscape. Arthur consulted his old analog compass and decided to fully follow the straight and convenient path, believing it would save him many difficult hours of dense bushwhacking. He walked with increasing confidence for nearly 20 minutes, maybe a mile, before the truck's faint engine sound completely disappeared behind the oppressive thicket of dense trees. That profound and isolating silence was the first undeniable sign that something about this strange, unfamiliar track was very wrong and should have warned him to turn around immediately. The day's heat felt much heavier and the dense canopy made the atmosphere noticeably more humid, despite the occasional slight breeze coming from the lake. The complication arrived when he saw the single, distinct set of deep, purposeful footprints pressed firmly into the damp, reddish mud of the new track near the tree line. They were much too deep and much too clearly defined to belong to a regular hiker wearing ordinary lightweight boots on a casual recreational walk that afternoon. The excessive depth strongly suggested the unknown person was carrying a truly enormous, unsustainable weight of at least 200 pounds beyond their own natural body weight. Arthur was a highly experienced woodsman who instinctively knew the crucial difference between a person carrying an ordinary light pack and someone struggling with an incredible, oppressive load. He crouched down to examine the detailed tread pattern, noting it was a thick, unmistakable industrial sole that looked like a common, heavy-duty work boot widely used in construction. He followed the heavy prints for a short distance, confirming their excessive and unchanging depth until they suddenly veered sharply off the narrow logging road and into the brush. The heavy impressions then vanished completely and without a trace among the slippery, mossy granite rocks and thick patches of tenacious undergrowth near a small, gurgling streambed. He carefully documented the stride length, which was unusually short, clearly indicating great physical struggle while attempting to move quickly across the uneven ground. Arthur stood where the prints abruptly ended and felt a cold knot of genuine alarm form in the pit of his stomach regarding this peculiar disappearance near the sound of running water. He then found a discarded piece of stiff, brightly colored yellow rope, a synthetic polyester strand about 3 feet in length, tangled with some old pine needles and forest debris. It was decidedly not a piece of personal climbing rope, and it was certainly not the simple cord a logger or an ordinary hiker would typically carry for personal use or survival in the woods. The unique yellow cord was neatly knotted at both ends using a complex binding knot that suggested a specific, forceful, and purposeful application or tie-down of some kind. He took several close-up photographs of the detailed muddy boot prints and the peculiar knotted yellow rope using his old twin-lens reflex camera for evidence. This particular synthetic color and durable material was commonly used for securing extremely heavy materials during construction or transport on certain industrial barges or heavy equipment worksites. He carefully bagged the rope as material evidence, absolutely certain it was the key to understanding the heavy person's mysterious purpose and final destination here in the remote area. The rope itself felt slightly frayed in the middle, reportedly indicating recent intense friction under a tremendous, crushing weight that could not be easily carried. Arthur then began his cautious and methodical investigation of the immediate surrounding area, looking for more crucial evidence of this unknown, very heavy traveler. He pulled out his survey equipment and used his brass theodolite to establish a meticulous grid and mark the exact, precise location where the heavy prince had abruptly disappeared into the underbrush. Dispatch logs and later witness statements would confirm that this specific area was known only for its derelict seasonal fishing cabins, but had absolutely no year-round permanent residents whatsoever. Arthur spent a detailed hour circling the exact spot, carefully noting the direction of the prince and estimating the traveler's likely physical height from their short, struggling stride length and gait. He realized the person was likely moving directly toward the abandoned cabin properties near the dark lake, rather than heading further into the deep, impenetrable woods with his heavy load. The logic became increasingly clear. The traveler took the unmarked logging road to drastically shorten the journey and then cut into the trees to avoid detection near the potentially inhabited sections of the lakeshore. He considered briefly turning back due to the sinking sun and his growing anxiety, but the lure of the mystery and his professional commitment to his own project kept him pushing forward along the raw, twisting track. He checked his handheld radio, which provided no signal, further confirming the area's complete and utter isolation that afternoon in late July. He found the abandoned campsite about 400 yards further along the logging track, now more heavily obscured by thick stands of whispering, silent pines and dense undergrowth growing wild. There was no established blackened fire ring and absolutely no personal tent, which strongly suggested the site was only used briefly and under great physical duress or urgent time pressure. The complete lack of ordinary camping gear implied the traveler was moving with a singular, non-recreational purpose and only intended a short, desperate, temporary stopover with his illicit materials. The most critical finding was a small, grimy aluminum tag that was partially stuck to an old, deteriorating piece of dark canvas tarp half buried in the wet forest dirt. The tag was clearly stamped with the capital letters T, T, C, and a single faded but still perfectly legible number near the bottom edge of the small metal artifact. Arthur carefully used his small pocket knife to free the tag from the rigid canvas and tucked the vital piece of evidence safely into the zipped pocket of his field shirt for the authorities. He spent a few more meticulous minutes searching the surrounding area, noting a single distinctly flattened section of ferns that suggested a massive, heavy object had rested there for a short time. He then quickly started the return journey, knowing he had enough compelling evidence to share with the necessary local law enforcement authorities. Arthur hypothesized that the strange letters T, T, C might be a local trapping club, or perhaps a small, obscure taxidermy company that operated secretly near the remote lake shore. The aluminum material of the tag suggested a utility marker, possibly for equipment or a very large container that had been somehow moved through the secluded area. He thought about the very heavy load and the purposeful track, then considered a scenario of extensive illegal trapping or a large, cumbersome animal carcass being moved. The sun was now sinking quickly, and the rapidly changing light told him it was time to leave the unsettling quiet of the backwoods and the growing shadows immediately. He followed his own footprints back to the waiting pickup truck and drove straight to the small, unassuming ranger station in the nearest rural settlement before dark. He remained unnerved by the specific weight of the load implied by the prince, which seemed far too great for even a very large deer or moose carcass to be carried by one person. He arrived at the station just before the closing hour and handed over the strange yellow knotted rope, the metal tag, and the roll of film from his camera to the officer. The duty officer was a very quiet and thoughtful man named Harlan Moss, who listened patiently and carefully to Arthur's detailed account of the unmarked back road. Harlan spread the physical evidence out on his metal desk, examining the knot in the rope and then staring hard at the small stamped aluminum tag with increasing focus. Arthur reiterated that the logging track was not on his official topographical maps and firmly emphasized the extraordinary and unnatural depth of the dark boot prints. Harlan nodded slowly as he picked up the small T, C tag and his expression suddenly turned from neutral to very grim and unequivocally serious. He quietly explained that the letters T, T, C did not stand for any local business or any recreational club or known organization in the entire surrounding region. This was the surprising twist and the unsettling payoff to a deeply concerning and mysterious afternoon near the secluded Maine lake and the abandoned properties. Harlan explained that T, T, C actually stood for the formal name of the Town Trustee Company, a large real estate holding group based many states away from the region of Maine. Reportedly, this large company purchased very old tax-delinquent properties that had been abandoned and were currently awaiting official demolition for a large new development project. The faded number on the aluminum tag perfectly matched the specific inventory number of a single derelict lakeside cabin that had been reported empty for well over a year. The cabin was conveniently located less than 2 miles from where Arthur had found the strange, heavy footprints and the discarded, knotted yellow rope in the mud. Archived calls confirmed a nearby neighbor had recently reported squatters on the isolated property in the previous month who were likely salvaging valuable materials. Harlan then opened a manila file on his desk showing a missing person flyer that was dated exactly 4 weeks prior to Arthur's unsettling discovery in the remote woods. The flyer showed a clear, sharp photograph of a man in his late 20s who was officially reported missing after failing to check in with his concerned family near the state line. Harlan quietly confirmed that the local deputy had taken a photograph of this man near the exact derelict property with the matching inventory tag number only weeks earlier. The man was reportedly carrying an absolutely massive, oversized dark duffel bag when he was last positively seen walking toward the hidden, unmapped dirt logging road near the cabin property. Witness statements and archived photos from a nearby gas station indicated the man was wearing heavy, treaded work boots, extremely similar to the detailed prints Arthur had documented near the small stream bed. The compelling theory was that the missing man had stopped at the derelict Town Trustee Company cabin to steal a large, extremely valuable quantity of scrap metal before the official demolition crew arrived. Authorities later confirmed that copper and brass components had recently been stripped from the interior walls and basement of the tagged cabin structure. The physical evidence, including the unnaturally deep boot prints and the specific knotted yellow rope, strongly suggested he was hauling something immense and very heavy away from the abandoned lakeside property. The estimated sheer weight of the load, based on the documented depth of the prints, was clearly far beyond anything a single person could possibly carry for a long distance on that rugged, difficult terrain. Harlan suggested the knotted rope was likely used to secure a large, unwieldy load of heavy copper piping or perhaps some form of industrial machinery taken from inside the derelict structure. Final footage retrieved from a remote security camera located on a distant gas pump later showed the missing man driving his own vehicle out of town entirely empty-handed and looking physically exhausted. This last confirmed sighting was approximately 3 days after he was initially seen walking confidently toward the derelict cabin, with the massive, oversized duffel bag in tow behind him. The official missing person case remains active and fully unsolved, but the widely held consensus belief among the locals is that the secretive backroad took his mysterious haul, but miraculously allowed the man to walk away completely clean. The true fate of the copper and the missing duffel bag remains an open, unanswered question to this very day within the small Maine community. The heavy haul was never found, and no trace of the stolen metal was ever officially recovered, despite extensive searches near the remote cabin property and surrounding woods. Arthur Gagne provided his detailed maps and professional photographs to the authorities and then finished his survey work nearby without any further incident or trouble. He never took another tempting shortcut in the deep remote woods of Maine again and always stayed strictly on the safer, established paved roads from that day forward. The dense woods around Lake Mattawamkeag keep their secrets closely guarded, and some old back roads are truly best left completely unexplored and forgotten by everyone. This ranger station log is a silent warning. In 1995, a ranger station in the Pacific Northwest vanished without a trace. The logbook was found miles away. Claire Wexler was 32 years old and worked as a wildlife biologist with a knack for tracking rare species. One morning, she set out to check the remote ranger station near Timber Peak. Her goal was simple: retrieve data from motion cameras set up weeks ago. The wooden cabin sat deep in the woods, accessible only by a narrow dirt road few dared to take. As Claire approached the clearing where the station should have been, something felt off. The air was unnaturally still. No birdsong, no rustling leaves. Then she stopped dead in her tracks. The cabin wasn't there. Not burned down, not abandoned, it was simply gone. No debris, no tools, no signs of demolition. Just an empty space, staring back at her like a question mark. Confused, Claire pulled out her radio and tried contacting headquarters. Static. She checked her phone next. Still nothing. Frustrated, she decided to search the perimeter for clues. That's when she noticed it, a leather-bound logbook half buried under pine needles about 50 yards away. It looked old, its cover cracked and faded. Inside, neat handwriting filled page after page. But these weren't routine entries about weather or trail maintenance. These were frantic messages written by someone named Marcus, the last ranger stationed here. Day 21. One entry read: "Something's wrong. Cameras keep disappearing overnight. Found claw marks on trees near the stream." Another said, "Day 23. Heard growling outside my window last night. Thought it was bears, but they're too loud. Whatever this is, it doesn't sound natural." Claire sat cross-legged on the ground, flipping through more pages. Each entry grew shorter, more panicked. By day 28, Marcus had stopped writing altogether. On the final page, just 3 words scrawled in shaky letters: "It's inside now." Her heart pounded as she closed the book. Questions raced through her mind. What could have taken the entire cabin? Why hadn't anyone come looking for Marcus? And why did the logbook end up here, so far from the site? Back at her truck, Claire called headquarters again. This time, she got through. A gruff voice answered, "Dispatch. Go ahead." "This is Claire Wexler. I'm at the Timber Peak Station coordinates. There's a problem. The building's missing." There was a long pause before the dispatcher replied, "Copy that. Stay put. We'll send someone." Hours passed. Finally, 2 men in plain clothes arrived. They introduced themselves as agents from some kind of environmental task force. One asked to see the logbook. When Claire handed it over, their expressions darkened. "We've seen this before," the taller agent admitted quietly. A few other stations disappeared around the same time, all in remote areas. No survivors. "Why haven't I heard about this?" Claire demanded. "It's classified," the shorter agent said flatly. "We didn't want panic spreading." Over the next week, Claire pieced together what little information she could find. Dispatch logs mentioned strange seismic activity near the affected zones. Witness statements described eerie lights moving through the trees during the disappearances. Some claimed to hear roaring sounds, low and guttural, unlike anything known to science. Determined to uncover the truth, Claire returned to the site with gear borrowed from friends. She set up thermal cameras, audio recorders, even motion-triggered flares. For 3 nights, nothing happened. On the 4th night, everything changed. At exactly midnight, the temperature dropped 10 degrees within minutes. The cameras caught movement, something massive weaving between the trees. Its silhouette suggested enormous claws and shoulders hunched forward. The audio picked up a deep rumbling noise, almost like breathing. As it neared, one flare ignited automatically, lighting up the area briefly. What appeared on the footage made Claire's blood run cold. A creature stood nearly 8 feet tall, covered in thick fur, its eyes glowing faintly yellow. It stared directly at the camera before melting back into the darkness. Shaken but determined, Claire reviewed all her evidence. Cross-referencing witness reports and archived calls, she realized the disappearances coincided with migration patterns of an unknown predator. Perhaps something ancient, driven north by climate change, now roaming territories once thought safe. When she presented her findings to the task force, they listened intently but refused to act publicly. Instead, they offered her a deal. join them full-time to study the phenomenon discreetly. Reluctantly, she agreed. Years later, Claire still thinks about Marcus and the others who vanished. Every now and then, she dreams of those glowing yellow eyes watching her from the shadows. Maybe that's why she always keeps a flashlight handy, even in broad daylight. Some warnings are meant to be ignored. Others, they linger in your mind forever, waiting for the moment you least expect them. The story of the missing ranger station became legend among local biologists and park rangers. Whispers spread about creatures unseen, hunters older than humanity itself. Claire never spoke openly about what she saw that night, but her actions told a different story. She carried extra supplies whenever she ventured into the wilderness. She avoided certain trails altogether, and every time she entered a forest alone, she checked her surroundings twice as often. One evening, while preparing dinner in her small cabin near the edge of the woods, Claire heard a faint sound outside. At first, she dismissed it as wind or an animal. But then it came again, a low growl, distant but unmistakable. She froze, gripping the handle of a kitchen knife tightly. Slowly, she moved toward the window, peering into the darkness beyond. Nothing stirred in the moonlight, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching her. The next morning, she found fresh tracks near her porch, large, deeper than any bear print she'd ever seen. Whoever or whatever had left them wasn't afraid to come close. Claire snapped photos immediately, adding them to her growing collection of evidence. Though she never solved the mystery completely, she knew one thing for sure: the forest held secrets far older than modern science could explain. And somewhere deep within those woods, the silent warning remained a reminder that some dangers lie hidden until it's too late to escape. Claire learned to live with the uncertainty. After all, the woods don't care if you believe them or not. They wait patiently, holding their breath, ready to reveal their truths when the time is right. Until then, the best any of us can do is listen and hope we're prepared for what answers we might find. She kept the logbook locked in a safe at home, its pages untouched but never forgotten. Someday, someone else might need to know what happened at Timber Peak. Until then, the story stayed hers alone, a quiet burden carried through each passing season. For now, the forest remained quiet, but Claire knew better than to trust appearances. Beneath the surface, something waited, and maybe someday it would return. The missing hiker's final moments were recorded. Archived ranger notes mentioned a recovered camera found near a high ridge that rarely saw visitors during late season. The notes described footage showing a missing hiker's final hours that raised difficult questions for investigators who reviewed every frame. Ryland Keats was 31 and worked as a trail mapping contractor who supplied updated contour data to small county offices. He traveled often with a sturdy pack that held a compact camera used to document path conditions for seasonal reports. In early autumn of 2012, he drove toward a remote trail system known for long switchbacks across dry granite. He planned a single-day loop to record fresh erosion markers before a mild storm reached the upper valley. Weather forecasts promised stable conditions, which made him confident the trip would stay simple and quick. Ryland parked at a quiet turnout where tall sagebrush leaned against an old wooden sign that showed faded arrows. He locked his truck and followed the trail while morning light poured across pale boulders scattered along the slope. His goal was straightforward because he needed accurate images of a washed section near the midpoint where runoff carved new grooves. He kept a steady pace and stopped often to photograph loose rock patches for later labeling by county staff. Wind brushed across the ridge as thin shadows drifted over his boots in a slow, wavering pattern. The incident began when he reached the wash section and noticed fresh debris piled near a narrow drop that looked unstable. He stepped closer and tapped the edge with his trekking pole while hearing a muted rumble under the gravel. He recorded a short video while describing the weak surface, which was standard practice for his field notes. A faint clatter echoed from below, which made him glance toward the lower ravine with cautious curiosity. He thought a distant animal moved among loose stones, yet the sound felt strangely repetitive and steady. He continued forward and reached a bend where the trail pressed against a sheer wall of pale stone shaped by long season winds. He heard the same clatter again, followed by a dull snap that reminded him of shifting wood. The sound grew sharper, which made him raise his camera in case a small rock slide began above him. He said, "This might get rough," while the recording captured thin dust falling from a narrow crack near the upper ledge. Rylan hesitated before moving on because the trail felt tense in a way he rarely experienced. Investigators later noted that his footage showed a thin shadow moving across the ridge that did not match cloud cover patterns. Witness statements from other hikers mentioned occasional mountain goats near that region, though none reported unusual activity that week. At the time, Rylan likely assumed a stray animal caused the noise, which kept him alert but not frightened. He pressed deeper into the ridge area, where an abandoned survey marker stood half buried in fractured soil. The shadow appeared again in his video, which became a central detail in the later investigation. Complication developed when he reached a narrow crossing that bridged two sections of jagged slope with a short drop beneath. He recorded a close view of an older rope line that previous crews left behind, which frayed heavily after years of desert sun. In the video, he tapped the rope lightly and said, "This will not hold another season," which showed his practical concern. A new gust swept through the crossing and pushed loose sand against his legs, while the camera steadied on the unstable ridge. Another sharp snap sounded from the cliff, which made him look directly toward the upper ledge. Archived logs showed that his camera caught a brief figure-shaped outline on the ridge that seemed human yet slightly distorted by distance. Investigators could not confirm identity because the frame blurred from sudden motion as Rylan turned too quickly. When he steadied the camera, the outline had vanished, leaving only shifting dust trailing along the stone surface. The moment raised theories involving another hiker possibly trapped above or moving in a hazardous area. Deputies later searched the ridge but found no footprints matching a person standing in that position that day. He continued toward the final section of the loop and reached an old campsite used by past survey crews during early 2008. His camera recorded scattered debris that included a crushed food tin and a torn wind flap from a weather shelter. He commented briefly about the rising wind, which hummed across the ridge with stronger force than earlier. The sound in the footage mixed natural gusts with a low, rhythmic tone that investigators described as unsettling. That tone repeated every few seconds with the same timing as the earlier clatter. Rylan stood near the campsite fire ring and listened while turning his head slowly across the ridge top. He said, "Something keeps knocking," which demonstrated his growing concern about the repeated noise. A sudden vibration shook loose gravel at his feet, which caused him to step back sharply. His camera swung toward the drop where dust plumes rose from a hidden shelf just below the trail. He considered descending slightly to see the source, but the loose slope made that option dangerous even for experienced trail workers. The investigation phase began when the recovered footage showed him climbing toward the ridge crest instead of descending to the lower shelf. He likely believed the sound came from above and wanted a clearer view before deciding how to report the issue. The climb looked steady, though increasing wind pushed him sideways at several points during the effort. Once he reached the crest, he lifted the camera and captured a wide view of distant valley floor. The rhythmic tone echoed again though, now sharper, as if striking a metallic surface hidden beneath stone. Rylan walked along the crest with slow steps while panning the camera toward a cluster of weathered boulders stacked naturally by ancient erosion. Within the footage, a faint glint appeared under one block, which investigators reviewed repeatedly in slowed frames. The glint looked like thin metal exposed by recent movement, which matched the cracking sounds heard earlier. He crouched and brushed sand away from the small gap while describing a strange hollow space under the boulder. A light clatter responded from inside the narrow cavity in a way that startled him audibly. He said, "Is someone stuck down there?" which investigators considered a critical moment in the sequence. The footage caught a short pattern of taps that sounded intentional, according to audio specialists who reviewed the recording. Rylan leaned closer while calling out a second time, which confirmed his belief that a person might be trapped under collapsed stone. The cavity showed no safe entry point, so he circled the boulder in search of a wider opening. His voice sounded strained as growing wind carried dust into the recording. The twist developed once investigators matched the tapping pattern to an older Ranger distress code used before upgraded radios arrived in 2004. Few people remembered the pattern, which made its presence surprising during the initial case review. Archived incident reports revealed that a Ranger trainee went missing during a storm in 1997, somewhere near the same ridge. His remains were never recovered, and the case ended without clear resolution. Investigators could not confirm a link, but the distress pattern in Ryland's footage deeply troubled the review team. Ryland continued circling the boulder while saying, "I hear you, hold on," in a tone filled with urgency. Gravel shifted under his boots, which caused a thin crack to widen near the edge of the ridge crest. The camera caught a violent jolt as the ground collapsed slightly beneath him, sending a sheet of loose material down the slope. He scrambled backward and steadied himself while breathing heavily as dust clouded the view. The tapping stopped immediately, which made the moment even more alarming to investigators who later replayed that segment. He stepped closer again and reached toward the gap, believing someone waited inside that dark hollow. Before he touched the stone, a powerful gust struck the ridge and knocked him off balance toward the unstable edge. The camera captured a final blurred view of sky before tumbling down the slope where it bounced against rock in a series of chaotic impacts. Audio ended with a dull thud, followed by drifting wind, which carried faint static across the final seconds. Ryland did not survive the fall, according to the final recovery report. Search teams found his camera lodged between two boulders near the lower ravine during the following morning. No sign of another person or recent human remains appeared in the cavity where he heard the tapping. Rangers inspected the boulder thoroughly and found only old metal fragments from past survey gear that possibly shifted in changing temperatures. Investigators acknowledged that some sounds may have resulted from thermal expansion across hidden metal surfaces within the rock. However, they could not fully explain the rhythmic pattern recorded in the footage. The official conclusion stated that Ryland acted on a reasonable belief that someone required help, which drew him toward the dangerous ridgecrest. His death was ruled accidental due to unstable ground aggravated by increasing wind conditions. The case left many unanswered questions that circulates quietly in ranger stations when discussions turn toward unexplained field recordings. The footage remains archived with restricted access due to sensitive audio contained in several frames. Today, the ridge appears calm under broad sky, with only natural wind shaping the stone edges that line the trail. Hikers who pass the midpoint rarely notice the boulder that caused so much discussion during the investigation. Some report faint clattering during colder evenings, which they often dismiss as shifting metal from older survey equipment. Ryland's story remains a reminder that isolated trails can hold echoes from long-forgotten incidents that blend with natural noise in unsettling ways. The final minutes recorded by his camera still leave many listeners uneasy because the taps carry a timing that feels deliberate. Investigators emphasize the uncertainty and maintain that natural explanations remain plausible given environmental conditions across the ridge. Even so, the recording continues to raise quiet debate among those familiar with the region as questions linger across the empty slopes. The truth rests somewhere between shifting stone and fading memory, where the mountains keep their oldest stories hidden in plain silence. The librarian who opened the box no one claimed. The record logs for that small-town library always mentioned the same unclaimed box that sat locked for 17 years. Staff treated it like harmless clutter stored near the basement archives, though late shift workers quietly admitted they avoided it. Those notes rarely convinced anyone until a librarian named Marin Halley decided the box needed proper documentation for disposal. Marin was 34 and worked evening hours, creating updated catalog entries for old regional history books. She planned to finish a long list of tasks since a county inspection required all storage areas cleared before winter storms arrived. Her goal that night involved sorting donation bins and confirming whether any forgotten items needed official reports. She expected a routine shift filled with quiet hallways and the faint hum of old lights. She found the box near a shelf of outdated folios, where dust covered every surface except the lid, which looked recently brushed. The unclaimed tag showed a faded date from 2006, along with a note stating owner unknown. Marin lifted the box and felt a faint vibration like something shifted inside with slow, uneven rhythm. She wrote the detail in her task log and carried the box to her desk where better lighting waited. The lid held a rusted latch secured by an old padlock that snapped easily when she applied slight pressure. She opened the box and found a stack of envelope-sized photographs wrapped in a strip of linen that felt brittle. The top photograph showed a road cutting through farmland under a dim sky, though something near the horizon appeared blurred. Another photo showed an empty room with a chair positioned oddly close to a cracked window. No person appeared in any of the images. Marin checked the box interior and found a narrow notebook with handwriting that looked cramped as if the writer rushed. The first page read, "Start with the places that feel wrong. Do not wait until the light changes." She paused because the phrasing sounded more like a warning than a note. The following pages contained short entries dated across several weeks, though the ink smeared enough to make some words unreadable. One entry described footsteps outside a rural cabin despite no tracks found in nearby soil. She carried the notebook to the reading room where she photographed each legible page for preservation. As she worked, she noticed faint scratches on the table that formed a shape matching a symbol from one of the notebook margins. The symbol looked like a crooked line intersecting a circle near its base. She rubbed her finger across the scratch and felt grooves deeper than normal surface wear. She wrote another note describing the unexpected match. Marin returned to the box and sorted the photographs into rough chronological order based on light levels and weather shown in the backgrounds. Early photos looked harmless, though later ones showed more unusual details. One captured a shape standing near a derelict barn, though the outline appeared stretched in a way that did not match natural shadows. She leaned closer and noticed the shape pointed toward a distant ridge in the background. She checked the next photo, which showed the same ridge as if the photographer followed the direction. The notebook entry corresponding to that time described a night spent near that ridge while the writer listened to a sound that repeated every few minutes. The entry claimed the sound carried no echo across the valley, which made the writer believe it came from above ground rather than from within the soil. Another entry noted a series of lights drifting near tree lines during early morning hours. The writer described the lights as slow and steady rather than chaotic, which ruled out insects or passing vehicles. As Marin studied the entries, she realized the writer kept returning to the same locations despite earlier fear. The pattern suggested obsession or duty rather than random curiosity. She checked library records, hoping to match the handwriting with any known donor, but found none. She searched through the old sign in ledgers kept before digital systems replaced them. One entry from 2006 listed a visitor named Clive Delmer who requested access to regional surveys. No further record listed his name. She felt uneasy because some notebook entries described a library reading room similar to the one she currently used. One entry said the quiet made every shelf feel closer than before. Another mentioned a faint tapping heard under the floor near the archive hallway. She considered coincidence, but the specificity unsettled her. She walked to the archive hallway and listened carefully. The air stayed silent, though a faint draft carried through vents, which explained earlier noises reported by staff. She returned to her desk and examined the linen strip used to wrap the photographs. The fabric held faint marks resembling ink, though no clear letters formed. When she angled the linen near the lamp, she noticed a thin outline of the same symbol scratched into the reading table. The match confirmed the writer repeated the shape intentionally across multiple objects. She added the detail to her log and considered notifying the county archivist, though she wanted to finish initial review before sending any requests. The next notebook section contained a longer entry describing a night when the writer camped near a dried stream bed after following the drifting lights again. He claimed he heard a voice calling his name from the direction of the barn earlier photographed. The entry read, "The voice was thin at first, then clearer when the wind shifted." The writer searched the area but found only broken planks and disturbed straw. He believed someone hid inside the barn, though soil around the entrance held no fresh prints. Marin found the final entries more fragmented, as if the writer grew increasingly distressed. One described waking near a forest edge without remembering travel from the previous location. Another claimed someone knocked on his vehicle window during twilight, though the area remained empty when he looked. The last entry read, "The box stays safe only if I leave it where the silence feels unnatural." That single sentence made Marin glance around the library with a sudden sense of pressure. She stood and walked slowly toward the large front window where streetlights cast thin patches of gold across the parking lot. Wind moved loose flyers across the pavement while night insects tapped faintly against the glass. Everything outside appeared normal, yet she felt the atmosphere inside shift in subtle ways. She reminded herself that long shifts sometimes created tension unrelated to real danger. She returned to the basement to recheck the shelf where the box sat untouched for so long. She hoped to find additional labels or paperwork explaining how the box arrived. She found a yellowed form tucked behind a folio with incomplete handwriting. The form read delivered during staff transition and placed in interim storage. No signature followed, which made the form unofficial. She photographed the form for documentation and returned upstairs with the sense that someone intentionally left the box to be forgotten. Rain began tapping softly against the roof as Marin compiled her notes into a clear summary for the morning staff. She laid out the photos in order and noticed a new detail in the road image taken under dim sky. The horizon showed a faint streak similar to the blurred figure near the barn, though more distant. She checked the margin of the notebook page corresponding to that photograph. A small version of the same symbol appeared again near the bottom. She recalled earlier accounts from former employees who mentioned strange feelings near the archive hallway, though they never provided evidence. She walked the hallway again and paused near a vent that produced a rhythmic pulse as warm air cycled through. The sound matched the described uneven rhythm of the box vibration. She touched the wall near the vent and felt faint tremors likely caused by old pipes expanding under temperature shifts. She exhaled slowly and allowed the explanation to settle. When she returned to the reading room, she found the linen strip slightly shifted despite no draft strong enough to move it. She assumed static cling caused the shift and moved it back to the center of the table. She placed a paperweight on top to prevent further movement and continued writing her report. The final portion required listing any potential hazards, such as mold or unstable materials. She listed none since every item looked structurally safe. Near the end of her shift, she prepared to reseal the box so maintenance staff could transfer it to a secure archive room. She packed the photos and notebook carefully while noting the symbol appeared at least 12 times across various objects. She planned to recommend a full historical research request to determine whether the symbol appeared in older survey maps. She locked the box with a replacement latch and carried it toward the staircase. When she reached the landing, she paused because the building lights dimmed briefly before returning to normal. The power flicker caused a soft hum from the old overhead fixtures. She walked to the front desk and placed the box beside the logbook. As she wrote a final note, she heard a faint tap from the box interior. She froze and waited for another sound which never came. She reasoned that materials inside shifted due to earlier movement. Before leaving, she placed the box inside the staff vault to ensure limited access until morning review. She closed the vault and checked the latch twice. As she stepped outside, she glanced at the second-floor window, where a faint reflection caught her eye. The reflection appeared like a blurred shape near the glass, though she realized it was her own outline distorted by rain streaks. She walked to her car with steady breath while telling herself the shift simply ran longer than planned. Weeks later, research confirmed the symbol matched older boundary markers used by survey teams during the 1970s. The markers indicated unstable ground or unexplored property lines. That information explained the repeated symbols in the notebook, though it did not clarify the strange entries about voices or drifting lights. Marin accepted the likely explanation that the writer traveled through isolated terrain while exhausted, which amplified fear and confusion. Still, she kept digital copies of the photographs in a private file because certain blurred shapes never matched ordinary shadows. She believed the writer documented natural events filtered through stress and long nights spent alone. Even so, she felt compelled to check the basement shelf once more during later shifts to ensure no new boxes appeared without explanation. Each time she walked the hallway, she listened for unusual tapping, though she rarely heard more than old pipes settling. The box remained sealed in the vault, awaiting formal review, though Marin sensed the writer left it with deliberate purpose. She believed the true value lay in understanding why he feared silence more than any sound he described. Whenever she closed the library late at night, she felt a subtle pressure near the archive hallway that shifted the air in ways hard to describe. She told herself it was only the draft from aging vents, yet she always walked a little faster toward the exit before locking the doors behind her. Why this old tape from a lakeside cabin matters. The old tape surfaced during a renovation project that was supposed to be simple work for a contractor named Leland Hartley in early October 2009. He had been hired to clear debris from a group of aging cabins near a quiet northern lake that most locals avoided after sunset. The job paid well, and Leland planned to finish quickly so he could move on before winter storms reached the region. The cabin sat close to the water where the wind carried a strange low whistle that neighbors claimed never followed a predictable pattern. Leland ignored those comments because he trusted clear tasks more than vague warnings. Cabin 7 stood slightly apart from the others, with warped siding that leaned toward the trees as if the structure had slowly shifted over many years. Leland entered the cabin expecting dust and rodents, but he found an untouched living area with a thin layer of cold air that felt trapped rather than drafty. He swept each room until he reached a locked drawer in an old desk pushed against the far wall. The drawer held a single high-8 tape marked with the words "Final Weekend" printed in shaky letters that looked hurried. Leland disliked mysteries, yet something about the tape felt important because it clearly had not been meant for tourists. He brought the tape home so he could view it on an old player he kept in his garage from earlier work that required digitizing older media. When he loaded the tape, the screen flickered until a stable picture formed showing the interior of Cabin 7 from a low angle that suggested the camera sat on the kitchen counter. A couple appeared on screen, identified only by their chatter as Callum and Brina, both in their late 20s and visiting from an unnamed city. Their recorded timestamp showed late June 1999 during a stretch of unseasonably warm weather that made the lake appealing for weekend trips. The first part of the recording showed normal behavior, including joking comments about burned food and the slow lake breeze that drifted through the open door. Their voices carried confidence that came from long familiarity, and they planned to hike a small ridge near the water the next morning. Nothing in their behavior suggested fear or concern because they believed the cabin offered typical comfort. Yet several minutes into the tape, Brina paused with sudden tension after a faint clicking sound came from the direction of the bedroom hallway. Callum checked the hallway without finding anything unusual, but his uncertain shrug indicated he also heard the noise. The tape continued with small shifts in tone as the couple tried to relax, but their glances toward the hall became more frequent. The clicking sound returned twice with sharper timing, as if something tapped the floor intentionally. The camera angle could not capture the hallway clearly, so viewers could only observe Callum and Brina reacting rather than identifying the source. The couple closed all interior doors before setting up a board game that seemed intended to distract them. They lasted 12 minutes before a heavy thump reached the microphone with unmistakable force that caused several items on the counter to shake. Callum grabbed a flashlight and told Brina to stay where she was, but she followed him despite visible fear because silence after the thump felt worse than confronting the unknown source. The footage grew grainy as the couple walked toward the hallway due to aging tape quality. A sudden burst of white noise filled the screen for 2 seconds before the image returned, revealing the hallway door wide open even though the couple had locked it earlier. Brina whispered for Callum to back away, but he stepped forward until he reached the doorway and aimed the flashlight inside the room. The beam landed on stacked boxes and an overturned chair that looked ordinary at first glance, until one box shifted slightly without any visible pressure. Callum inhaled sharply, and the camera captured his hand, trembling as he reached for the doorknob. The light flickered again, then the image cut to another angle of the cabin, as if the camera had been moved by someone off-screen. This change confused Leland because the couple had not touched the device. The new angle showed the living area empty and the bedroom door closed once again. The couple did not return to the frame. The next section of the tape showed night hours passing in accelerated fashion due to a recording glitch that reduced light and sound to faint smears of motion and static. The cabin windows reflected occasional flashes that looked like headlights, but no engine sounds followed those bursts. At one point, a narrow silhouette crossed in front of a window with a smooth, gliding motion that suggested intentional observation. The figure stood still for several seconds, with its head tilted toward the camera, before fading from view with sudden abruptness rather than walking away. Leland rewound that portion several times, trying to analyze the shape without success. The figure held no clear human outline because its limbs appeared slightly elongated and its shoulders seemed uneven. The image quality prevented definite identification, but the posture carried a sense of quiet confidence as if the figure belonged there. After this sequence, the recording shifted back to real time with the morning sun filling the cabin. The door hung partly open and a single backpack rested near the threshold while the rest of the cabin remained undisturbed. Callum and Brina were not visible and no sound came from outside. Authorities reportedly searched for the couple in 1999 after their car remained parked near the lake for 3 days. Weather records from that week showed stable conditions without storms or strong winds. Neither hiker left messages with family, and no financial activity followed their disappearance. Dispatch logs indicated brief patrol checks near the cabins, but no officer entered Cabin 7 because it appeared unoccupied. Their case eventually faded into local rumor that blamed the lake for hiding things too well. The community accepted those conclusions partly because no concrete evidence suggested foul play. Leland believed the tape provided new insight, so he attempted to digitize it for easier review. During this process, his software unearthed several corrupted fragments that did not appear during the initial viewing. One fragment showed the camera pointed directly at the bedroom door from a much lower angle as if placed on the floor. The door moved slightly inward, then froze before any object crossed the threshold. Another fragment displayed flashing images of the lake surface under moonlight, with ripples moving against the wind direction. The final fragment showed a close view of the interior closet with a faint shift of darkness inside. These fragments disturbed Leland because they implied the presence of someone or something that handled the camera while the couple remained in the cabin. He wondered why the device recorded partial moments instead of continuous footage. He also questioned whether the couple attempted to document the noises or if the unknown figure used the camera for its own reasons. His unease increased when he visited Cabin 7 again the following afternoon, hoping to verify structural issues or evidence of wildlife. The cabin felt warmer than before, and the closet door stood slightly ajar despite his memory of closing everything during cleanup. He found no tape in the drawer and no items in the closet besides old blankets stacked neatly against the wall. The air in the room held a faint metallic scent that faded the moment he stepped back into the living area. Leland noted these details before locking the cabin and leaving the property for good that evening. He delivered the digitized copy of the tape to a small regional archive that sometimes handled unusual historical material, though he did not share every detail. He considered telling law enforcement, but the lack of clear evidence discouraged him. Over the next week, he checked the archive for updates until a technician informed him that the digitized file showed unexplained corruption across every recovered fragment. The technician asked whether the original tape had been stored near strong magnetic interference, but Leland denied this possibility. When he attempted to show the technician the specific silhouette moment, it refused to play the section at all. The tape displayed a black screen where the figure once stood. The technician suggested the tape might be degrading faster than expected due to age. Leland kept a single backup of the original digitization on his home computer, which he reviewed late one night after noticing a soft clicking sound in his hallway. He paused the review and investigated the noise until he reached his living room, where the sound stopped entirely. The incident reminded him too strongly of the cabin recording, so he returned to the computer only to find the backup file missing from his hard drive. He checked every folder until sunrise without locating the footage or any trace of deletion. The missing file convinced him that the cabin experience carried more weight than simple curiosity. He believed someone had returned to retrieve the original tape and possibly acted to remove any digital copy. He considered returning to Cabin 7 one last time, but he avoided the area because the lake now felt like a boundary rather than a destination. Leland continued his renovation work elsewhere for several years while keeping his distance from that property. Today, the cabins remain abandoned and overgrown, following a fire that destroyed most structures 3 years after Leland found the tape. Reports suggested the fire began near Cabin 7, though no official cause appeared in public summaries. Leland never returned to the site because the memory of the couple and the silhouette forced him to accept that certain places hold stories that resist closure. He still remembers the quiet moment when the camera captured the closet door shifting inward without help. That single movement convinced him that the tape mattered because it recorded something patient enough to wait for the right moment and quiet enough to stay unseen until the couple reached the hallway. This dispatch recording reveals a final warning. The tape emerged during a major equipment cleanup in early November 2010 when a junior technician named Corbin Weller sorted an old storage closet in a small mountain dispatch station near a quiet highway. He expected dust and broken headsets, yet he found a battered reel marked Night Alert with a smeared date that suggested years of neglect. Corbin planned to toss anything unreadable, but the careful handwriting on the label felt intentional enough to keep him curious. He waited until his shift ended before loading the tape into an aging player in the break room. The audio crackled twice before locking into a clear channel that carried the steady voice of dispatcher Rowan Pike, who had worked overnight duty for years without incident. His calm tone described routine conditions on the Ridge Road with dry pavement and light wind that made the route easy for travelers. A ranger named Tessa Rourke checked in from the overlooked turnout where she monitored late traffic for safety concerns. Her voice carried the relaxed confidence of someone who treated the mountain as familiar ground rather than difficult terrain, even during long, quiet hours. 6 minutes into the recording, Rowan asked about a faint tapping behind her speech that sounded like metal nudged at a slow rhythm under shifting pressure. Tessa paused, then admitted she heard it too, although she believed it came from a loose drainage grate near the turnout that often rattled after dusk. She dismissed the sound as ordinary maintenance trouble while assuring him she would inspect it soon. Rowan accepted her answer, yet the tapping continued with steady timing that broke from typical weather patterns and made him uneasy despite his training. The tape captured a slight tremble in her radio as the tapping grew sharper, as if something heavy pressed against the grate with deliberate force. Rowan told her to stay alert because the pattern felt too precise for random vibration. She agreed while stepping back toward her patrol truck with boots crunching over cold gravel. The microphone picked up her breathing, which turned fast and shallow once the tapping stopped without any fading interval. She whispered that she sensed movement beyond the tree line, though she could not yet identify size or shape. Rowan asked for details, and her answer arrived in a tense, quiet tone that carried controlled fear. She said a tall, narrow figure stood between two pines with a posture that looked too still for any animal she recognized along these routes. She insisted the shape did not sway with the wind and seemed angled toward her position in a watching stance. Rowan instructed her to get inside her vehicle and lock the doors until he contacted the closest ranger for support. She acknowledged him, then moved quickly with clear urgency. Her door slammed on the audio and the engine rumbled through the static as she locked every entry. She reported that the figure now stood behind her truck, though still out of direct light. A slow scrape crept across the microphone like metal dragging on painted steel as something brushed her tailgate. Rowan demanded a clear description once she raised her spotlight toward the rear window. Her breath caught as the beam hit the figure, which shifted instantly toward the forest, with unnatural speed that she described as wrong for any human motion she had seen on duty. The figure vanished among the trees without sound, which unsettled Rowan more than the earlier tapping. He tried to calm her while confirming that backup needed 15 minutes to reach the turnout. The tape held a long, silent stretch where only the hum of her engine filled the channel. Tessa finally said she felt watched again, though she could not see any movement between the trees because the darkness felt too thick for her spotlight. Rowan kept her talking, so she stayed grounded, but her voice remained strained. A deep thud echoed through the microphone, and she claimed the ground seemed to pulse beneath her boots before she entered the vehicle. Rowan asked her to repeat that because he thought he misheard, but she insisted the soil shifted in a slow wave under the gravel. He tried to rationalize the thud as settling rock common in cold mountain regions, though his tone betrayed doubt. She said the pulse traveled in a direction rather than spreading evenly, which made her believe something moved beneath the turnout. The recording grew distorted as she whispered that the figure returned, though now it stood beside a tree much closer to her passenger door. Rowan called her name with sharp urgency while she scrambled for better visibility through the window. A sudden metallic impact rang through the microphone, followed by a short cry that cut off with chilling abruptness. Static flooded the audio, then dissolved into hollow silence while the engine continued to idle steadily. Rowan repeated her name several times without response and finally switched channels to call for immediate assistance. Backup reached the turnout with lights sweeping across frost-covered ground. They found her truck idling with the driver door wide open and her radio placed carefully on the seat. No footprints or drag marks circled the vehicle despite soft frost that should have recorded every movement. The official report suggested she chased a possible trespasser into the forest and became disoriented, which local volunteers quietly disputed after helping with extended searches that revealed no trace of her anywhere near the ridge or the play. Lower trails. Corbin listened to the tape twice more before admitting he felt nervous inside the break room, even with fluorescent lights above him. He believed she encountered a trespasser, but could not explain the absence of tracks or the underground pulse she described with steady clarity. He investigated the drainage grate during his next shift, yet found no height or depth that matched the deep thud carried on the recording. The grate showed no damage and no signs of forced pressure that could create rhythmic tapping. He brought the tape to his supervisor, who sealed it inside a locked archive drawer scheduled for regional review. 2 days later, the drawer held no tape and no sign that it had ever been checked out. The supervisor assumed a filing error, yet Corbin found no similar reel anywhere in the station. His only comfort came from a private digital copy he made during the initial playback out of habit rather than suspicion. During late shifts, he sometimes heard faint tapping under the dispatch floor during quiet hours. He dismissed the sound as old pipes adjusting to cold air, though the taps followed the same slow rhythm he remembered from the tape. Each time the tapping stopped sharply, the room filled with tense silence, identical to the moment before her final warning. Corbin avoided mentioning these incidents because he feared they would sound like imagination rather than observation. Months passed before he rewatched the digital copy and realized something new. The final second before the static carried a soft breath from outside the truck rather than inside. The breath sounded deep, steady, and close to the microphone, as if someone leaned near the open door with calm patience. The breath ended with a faint step that barely registered through the static, but held weight that did not match her lighter movements captured earlier. Years later, the digital copy remains the only surviving record of that night because the original tape never resurfaced. Corbin keeps the file on a single encrypted drive that he rarely opens because the final breath unsettles him more than any other part of the recording. He believes the breath matters because it proves someone stood beside her truck before the static claimed the channel, which means her last fear was not imagined but observed. The quiet truth behind that railroad service tunnel. Dispatch logs from a rural county reportedly flagged a strange pattern that focused on an old tunnel near a maintenance siding. Those logs hinted at a series of calls that described footsteps inside the tunnel when no workers were scheduled to be there. Ferran Coyle was a 36-year-old track inspector who handled routine checks along a tired freight corridor that bordered pine scrub and scattered ranch properties. He arrived before sunrise on a cool morning in late 1999 with a simple plan to confirm reported drainage issues near the north entrance of the tunnel. He expected a quick inspection followed by a standard form filed at the small depot office. He parked his truck near the faded signal tower and slung his gear bag over one shoulder, while the sky turned slowly from deep blue to dull gray. He walked toward the tunnel mouth with the usual confidence of someone who had spent years inside tight places and decaying structures. His boots crunched evenly on gravel that clicked against the rust-stained rails. The plan changed after he spotted a narrow streak of mud across a maintenance door set into the concrete wall beside the entrance. He knew that door should have been sealed 2 months earlier after an internal order directed crews to retire a forgotten tool alcove behind it. The instructions were clear on company records that the alcove had become unsafe after repeated washouts and was not to be opened again. Ferran crouched to study the door and saw fresh scuff marks near the bottom that looked like someone had scraped something heavy across the frame. A thin line of water traced down from the latch and darkened the gravel below. He listened for movement and heard a faint tap that sounded like metal striking stone somewhere inside the tunnel where darkness gathered like a heavy curtain. Witness accounts from workers who had used the tunnel in earlier years mentioned odd sounds during night shifts that resembled a slow dragging rhythm. Those older reports were never confirmed by supervisors and were often dismissed as stress-induced hearing fatigue. Ferran had always believed those stories held small grains of truth that deserved respect. He opened his notebook and wrote a quick timestamp, followed by a simple description of the muddy door. He raised a small portable recorder and pressed the worn button to capture ambient noise that pulsed through the tunnel. The tap grew stronger, as if echoing against a deeper chamber. The sound pattern matched older recordings stored in a dusty cabinet at the depot that he had reviewed the previous winter. Ferran unlatched the maintenance door and stepped inside the alcove that smelled strongly of wet soil and neglected machinery. The beam from his flashlight struck rows of rusted tool hooks lining the walls. Several hooks were empty, even though inventory sheets claimed every item had been removed during the official closure. A slim track wrench lay on the ground near the far corner with a layer of clean grit across half its handle that suggested it had been dropped recently. He examined the floor and found a thin trail of dark sludge that continued toward a narrow gap behind a leaning support panel. The panel looked as if someone had shoved it aside with a steady and deliberate force. Ferran moved closer and felt cool air rising through the gap with slow, steady pulses, like weak breaths drifting through broken stone. He radioed the depot office and reported a possible breach in the sealed alcove. The dispatcher asked him to hold position until a second inspector arrived from a yard 20 miles south. Ferran agreed, yet continued recording his surroundings because the tap inside the tunnel had grown into a hollow knocking pattern that sounded too rhythmic to be wind-driven. He pushed the panel aside and revealed a small cavity that workers had once used to route cables during upgrades that took place in the early 1980s. That cavity appeared larger than official diagrams showed and extended into a sloping passage coated with mud and shattered limestone flakes. He knelt to study the passage and saw faint shoe impressions that curved downward as if someone had walked into the dark without hesitation. Archived reports described a missing crew member who vanished near this tunnel during a severe storm in 1978. Search teams found none of his gear, and investigators noted that his last known position matched the location of the old cable cavity. Supervisors later wrote that he had likely slipped into rising runoff waters, then been carried beyond reach. Ferran always wondered why those files lacked detailed maps of the conduit network. He climbed into the passage while the distant knocking faded into a soft, repetitive thud that throbbed like a pulse behind heavy fabric. The air grew colder as he descended, and his flashlight beam caught a rust-colored streak across the left wall that narrowed into thin scratches. The scratches ran parallel for several feet, then split into branching marks that looked frantic and uneven. He recorded the marks and estimated their age based on the flaking debris gathered below them. The dryness of the flakes suggested they had formed many years earlier, yet the upper edges looked freshly chipped, which confused him and made him tighten his grip on the recorder. He walked deeper as the floor leveled and met a small junction space supported by old steel beams that bent slightly inward. He almost stepped on a folded jacket placed neatly near the base of one beam. The fabric was sun-faded and stiff, yet held a faint patch that matched the logo used by track crews in the 70s. Ferran photographed every angle and whispered, "How did it stay dry this long?" even though the recorder picked up the question with a faint crackle. Another passage continued beyond the junction and narrowed into a wedge-shaped corridor that veered under the main tunnel. Ferran followed the path while watching for loose stone that might collapse under his weight. The corridor opened into a circular chamber carved roughly by crews who had once planned to expand drainage culverts, yet abandoned the project due to unstable rock conditions. He swung the flashlight slowly and saw a small pile of objects arranged in a careful ring. The objects included a broken lantern base, a warped set of pliers, and a metal tag that belonged to an older uniform design. None of the pieces looked recent, yet a single tool lay in the center of the ring with clean edges and bright markings that indicated it had been used within the last week. He reached for the tool and paused when he felt vibrations under his boots that trembled through the chamber in short bursts. He checked his recorder and noted that the microphone captured a low, steady hum originating from the main tunnel. The hum pulsed like machinery, starting and stopping, despite no active equipment scheduled anywhere near this zone. He retreated to the junction and radioed the dispatcher with a brief description of the chamber and collected items. The dispatcher told him that the backup inspector was delayed due to a blocked crossing near the yard, which meant Farhan would need to remain at the site longer than expected. He felt uneasy and decided to exit the passage slowly while documenting each step. As he climbed upward, he heard a faint voice echo from deep below that sounded like a strained attempt to form a short warning. The syllables were unclear, yet carried enough urgency to speed his ascent. He emerged into the alcove and turned toward the main tunnel, where the hum had grown louder at a steady pace. His flashlight shook as he approached the mouth of the tunnel with long, careful strides. A shape moved near the center of the tracks where the darkness thickened. The shape flickered as if caught between the beam of his light and the shadows that clung to the walls. Farhan called out, asking if anyone needed assistance. The shape tilted slightly, then vanished as his beam passed across an empty stretch of rail. He repeated his call with firmer tone and waited for any response. He backed out of the tunnel and reached the open air where the gray sky offered familiar comfort. He steadied his breath and reviewed the footage on his recorder. The display showed faint distortions in the shape of a figure standing at the far end of the tunnel for 2 brief seconds before dissolving into static. The image remained too vague to confirm a person and could not be matched to any known worker silhouette. The second inspector arrived shortly after midday and followed Farhan into the alcove. They documented every detail, then sealed the cavity with reinforced plates ordered through an emergency maintenance request. Company officials later issued a short statement that the old cable routes had collapsed and created misleading impressions of deeper chambers. They ordered that the tunnel section be restricted until further geological checks were completed. Farhan never fully accepted the official explanation because his recorder held the voice fragment that carried a tone of warning rather than pain. Analysts reviewed the audio and concluded that the fragment likely came from echo bounce caused by shifting metal. Yet the cadence and pitch sounded too human and contained subtle dips that suggested controlled breath. Years later, Farhan kept the recorder locked in a metal drawer at his small apartment overlooking service yards. He sometimes played the fragment late at night when freight whistles traveled through the open windows. The voice always repeated the same unclear plea with a slow, trembling rhythm that matched the tapping he had heard on that morning. The quiet truth he often shared with trusted colleagues was simple. He believed that someone trapped deep under the tunnel had used the old cable routes to move toward the alcove, yet never reached the surface. He believed the ring of objects showed an attempt to gather tools for a climb that time eventually stopped. And he believed the final warning on the recording came from someone who wanted future workers to tread carefully in forgotten places where help might never arrive. Farhan understood that not all tunnels hide catastrophic secrets, and not all missing crew stories end with tragedy. Yet he also knew that silence in old service corridors often carries traces of lives that never found closure. When he passed the sealed alcove during later inspections, he paused for a moment of respect and continued down the line, carrying the recorder in his bag with steady, determined steps. What this abandoned rest stop revealed still haunts investigators. Highway crews still talk about the rest stop like it is some quiet bruise on the side of the old state road, the kind you notice only when the weather turns gray and the trees start leaning a little too close to the pavement. The building is gone now, replaced by a fenced patch of gravel, but the story stuck because of what happened to a surveyor named Kieran Holt. The case file is dusty, the statements are messy, and the investigators who worked the first week still say they never really settled on one clean explanation. They just know something was wrong there long before anyone realized they should have shut the place down tighter. Kieran was not the dramatic type. He was the kind of guy who always double-checked distances, kept backup batteries in his truck, and made small handwritten notes even when the radio logs were enough. He handled hundreds of miles of rural roads for the planning office, and that route took him through long stretches of quiet land where the only sound came from power lines humming over empty fields. People who knew him said he actually liked the silence because it made the work feel straightforward. He just measured things, wrote things, fixed things, and went home. That morning, he left before sunrise because he wanted to finish early and beat a patch of oncoming rain. The abandoned rest stop sat along his first checkpoint, and even though it had been closed for years, he still stopped there sometimes to take signal readings. It gave him a clear view of the ridge and the highway bend. It was habit more than necessity, and he had done it so many times that no one thought twice when they looked at his assigned route later. The patrol video that eventually became the anchor of the whole timeline showed his truck pulling up to the cracked entrance. He gets out, checks the sky, and walks toward the old restroom building with his binder under one arm. That is the last clear image of him moving normally. Everything after that is fragments. Investigators learned that the first thing that caught his attention was a shoe print, one clear print in a layer of pale dust near the doorway. It had sharp edges, almost fresh. He took a picture of it because that is what he did whenever something looked off. He was not paranoid, just methodical. He probably thought someone slept inside the building during the night. It happened sometimes on remote highways. He wrote down the time, circled the note, and stepped into the entrance. The hallway was dark and carried a strange, muffled echo, like the walls were padded even though they were just old tile. He heard a scraping sound from deeper inside. Not metal dragging, not an animal. Something steady and slow, like someone shifting their foot across grit. He called out, waited, and heard nothing. The sound stopped like it had been listening. Kieran walked back to his truck to radio the office, but his voice broke apart in static. The dispatcher later told investigators that the call sounded like it was underwater and bouncing through a long metal tube. She heard only fragments: his name, a location code, and something that sounded like movement inside. He tried again, and the signal died. That alone was unusual because that section of highway always had clean coverage. The binder recovered from his truck showed his own version of events. He wrote hallway sound, not wind, and then another line about a broken window at the back of the building. Investigators confirmed the window had been shattered outward. That meant something inside forced its way out, even though the inside had been boarded months earlier. Two highway workers driving through the area about an hour after Kieran arrived reported seeing a person moving inside the hallway. They saw the silhouette through the broken boards on the far window. They assumed it was Kieran and did not stop. Later, they both said the figure walked strangely, almost testing the ground each time it stepped forward. When Kieran failed to check in by midday, patrol deputies were sent to find him. His truck was still idling. The driver door was open. His binder was on the passenger seat with a page ripped halfway down. His pack lay near the broken window. The last photo on his camera showed the hallway inside the building. At the far end of the frame, barely visible, stood a faint figure leaning against the corner. No one could tell if it was facing the camera or facing away. Inside, deputies found scrape marks on the floor, thin, curved, following the left wall all the way to a locked storage room. The door showed no signs of force, yet the dust around it was swept clean in a straight line, as if something moved in and out repeatedly. The key they used to open it had to be fetched from the district office because no one had unlocked that door since the rest stop closed. Inside the storage room, they found an old maintenance cart shoved off to one side. Beneath it lay a faded maintenance log from the late 2000s mentioning a ventilation repair and a crawl opening behind a panel. The panel had been sealed for decades. The log was not supposed to be there. When investigators removed the panel, the cavity behind it ran deeper than any blueprint suggested. The air that came from the gap was cold and carried a metallic smell that clung to clothing. A search camera was lowered inside. The footage showed concrete walls narrowing into a crooked tunnel barely large enough for a grown man to crawl through. 10 feet in, the camera light hit something reflective. A highway vest. Not folded, not discarded. hanging there in a slack curve as if someone had leaned their back against the wall and slid downward. No body, no markings, no drag trails. Just a vest that did not match any active crew assignments. Temperature drops inside the cavity were recorded several times. Each time the camera paused, the air dipped sharply. No external vents, no crosswind, no clear cause. The readings were entered into evidence but never explained. Investigators expanded the search into the forest beyond the rest stop. Dogs were brought in, drones were flown. For 3 days, they found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no cloth fibers. Only a small piece of metal near the far tree line, a fragment from a maintenance badge series retired decades earlier. Demolition crews arrived weeks later. They tore down the restroom building section by section. Workers reported strange acoustics in the hallway where Kieran took his final photo. Their tools sounded muted, as if wrapped in thick cloth. When they opened the wall near the crawl cavity, they found only a narrow, empty slot and a single metal hook drilled into the concrete. The hook had no purpose. The record showed no installation request. It faced inward, toward the cavity, like something had hung there long ago. In a thin layer of dust near the base of the cavity, they found a scrap of notebook paper. The edges were frayed as if torn in a hurry. The paper held 2 words in Kieran's handwriting. Saw movement. No time. No location. No arrows. Just those 2 words. Deputies later said the note bothered them more than anything else. He was careful, organized, and thorough. He always wrote full details. The only reason he would write something that vague was if he did not have time to write anything else. The rest stop was leveled to the foundation. The land was fenced off. The planning office rerouted all field checks away from the area. They said it was because the ground had become unstable, but the people who handled the paperwork knew that was just the clean explanation. Highway Patrol still reports occasional signal dips near the bend, only for a second, only when the morning fog is low. One deputy said he once saw a figure near the fence line in the gray light, standing too still to be a deer and too tall to be anyone from the service crew. When he turned the cruiser around, the figure was gone. The old case file sits in a drawer labeled Holt, Kieran. The binder, the camera, the scrap of paper, the vest, the temperature logs, the patrol video. None of it answers the basic question of where he went. Investigators who worked the early days still say the same thing when the topic comes up during late shifts. Whatever moved inside that building did not walk out through any of the exits. And whatever Kieran saw in that hallway moved first. What this abandoned rest stop revealed still haunts investigators. Highway crews still talk about the rest stop like it is some quiet bruise on the side of the old state road, the kind you notice only when the weather turns gray and the trees start leaning a little too close to the pavement. The building is gone now, replaced by a fenced patch of gravel, but the story stuck because of what happened to a surveyor named Kieran Holt. The case file is dusty, the statements are messy, and the investigators who worked the first week still say they never really settled on one clean explanation. They just know something was wrong there, long before anyone realized they should have shut the place down tighter. Kieran was not the dramatic type. He was the kind of guy who always double-checked distances, kept backup batteries in his truck, and made small handwritten notes even when the radio logs were enough. He handled hundreds of miles of rural roads for the planning office, and that route took him through long stretches of quiet land where the only sound came from power lines humming over empty fields. People who knew him said he actually liked the silence because it made the work feel straightforward. He just measured things, wrote things, fixed things, and went home. That morning, he left before sunrise because he wanted to finish early and beat a patch of oncoming rain. The abandoned rest stop sat along his first checkpoint, and even though it had been closed for years, he still stopped there sometimes to take signal readings. It gave him a clear view of the ridge and the highway bend. It was habit more than necessity, and he had done it so many times that no one thought twice when they looked at his assigned route later. The patrol video that eventually became the anchor of the whole timeline showed his truck pulling up to the cracked entrance. He gets out, checks the sky, and walks toward the old restroom building with his binder under one arm. That is the last clear image of him moving normally. Everything after that is fragments. Investigators learned that the first thing that caught his attention was a shoe print. one clear print in a layer of pale dust near the doorway. It had sharp edges, almost fresh. He took a picture of it because that is what he did whenever something looked off. He was not paranoid, just methodical. He probably thought someone slept inside the building during the night. It happens sometimes on remote highways. He wrote down the time, circled the note, and stepped into the entrance. The hallway was dark and carried a strange, muffled echo, like the walls were padded even though they were just old tile. He heard a scraping sound from deeper inside. Not metal dragging, not an animal. Something steady and slow, like someone shifting their foot across grit. He called out, waited, and heard nothing. The sound stopped like it had been listening. Kieran walked back to his truck to radio the office, but his voice broke apart in static. The dispatcher later told investigators that the call sounded like it was underwater and bouncing through a long metal tube. She heard only fragments: his name, a location code, and something that sounded like movement inside. He tried again, and the signal died. That alone was unusual because that section of highway always had clean coverage. The binder recovered from his truck showed his own version of events. He wrote hallway sound, not wind, and then another line about a broken window at the back of the building. Investigators confirmed the window had been shattered outward. That meant something inside forced its way out, even though the inside had been boarded months earlier. Two highway workers driving through the area about an hour after Kieran arrived reported seeing a person moving inside the hallway. They saw the silhouette through the broken boards on the far window. They assumed it was Kieran and did not stop. Later, they both said the figure walked strangely, almost testing the ground each time it stepped forward. When Kieran failed to check in by midday, patrol deputies were sent to find him. His truck was still idling. The driver door was open. His binder was on the passenger seat with a page ripped halfway down. His pack lay near the broken window. The last photo on his camera showed the hallway inside the building. At the far end of the frame, barely visible, stood a faint figure leaning against the corner. No one could tell if it was facing the camera or facing away. Inside, deputies found scrape marks on the floor, thin, curved, following the left wall all the way to a locked storage room. The door showed no signs of force, yet the dust around it was swept clean in a straight line, as if something moved in and out repeatedly. The key they used to open it had to be fetched from the district office because no one had unlocked that door since the rest stop closed. Inside the storage room, they found an old maintenance cart shoved off to one side. Beneath it lay a faded maintenance log from the late 2000s mentioning a ventilation repair and a crawl opening behind a panel. The panel had been sealed for decades. The log was not supposed to be there. When investigators removed the panel, the cavity behind it ran deeper than any blueprint suggested. The air that came from the gap was cold and carried a metallic smell that clung to clothing. A search camera was lowered inside. The footage showed concrete walls narrowing into a crooked tunnel barely large enough for a grown man to crawl through. 10 feet in, the camera light hit something reflective. A highway vest. Not folded, not discarded. Hanging there in a slack curve as if someone had leaned their back against the wall and slid downward. No body, no markings, no drag trails. Just a vest that did not match any active crew assignments. Temperature drops inside the cavity were recorded several times. Each time the camera paused, the air dipped sharply. No external vents, no crosswind, no clear cause. The readings were entered into evidence but never explained. Investigators expanded the search into the forest beyond the rest stop. Dogs were brought in, drones were flown. For 3 days, they found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no cloth fibers. Only a small piece of metal near the far tree line, a fragment from a maintenance badge series retired decades earlier. Demolition crews arrived weeks later. They tore down the restroom building section by section. Workers reported strange acoustics in the hallway where Kieran took his final photo. Their tools sounded muted, as if wrapped in thick cloth. When they opened the wall near the crawl cavity, they found only a narrow, empty slot and a single metal hook drilled into the concrete. The hook had no purpose. The record showed no installation request. It faced inward, toward the cavity, like something had hung there long ago. In a thin layer of dust near the base of the cavity, they found a scrap of notebook paper. The edges were frayed as if torn in a hurry. The paper held two words in Kieran's handwriting: saw movement, no time, no location, no arrows, just those two words. Deputies later said the note bothered them more than anything else. He was careful, organized, and thorough. He always wrote full details. The only reason he would write something that vague was if he did not have time to write anything else. The rest stop was leveled to the foundation. The land was fenced off. The planning office rerouted all field checks away from the area. They said it was because the ground had become unstable, but the people who handled the paperwork knew that was just the clean explanation. Highway Patrol still reports occasional signal dips near the bend, only for a second, only when the morning fog is low. One deputy said he once saw a figure near the fence line in the gray light, standing too still to be a deer and too tall to be anyone from the service crew. When he turned the cruiser around, the figure was gone. The old case file sits in a drawer labeled Holt, Kieran. The binder, the camera, the scrap of paper, the vest, the temperature logs, the patrol video. None of it answers the basic question of where he went. Investigators who worked the early days still say the same thing when the topic comes up during late shifts. Whatever moved inside that building did not walk out through any of the exits. And whatever Kieran saw in that hallway moved first.